ashamed, gives her answer, "The passing of Arthur, so much as thou hast, so much art thou worth, and so much do I love thee," without any preface to soften the bluntness of her speech. The moral of the tale is thus rendered, accordingly. Hence hath been derived the saying, "Things moderately said are ever the more to be appreciated," a platitude, perhaps, not altogether destitute of point in the mouth of Geoffrey of Monmouth. Other discrepancies are slight and few. The elaborages of the later version are the Senones. Brennius is Brennus, the supreme of men, the glory of the brave, the eternal star of Britain. Tenuantius is Thermantius, and a few other names are differently spelt, but no significant variant occurs till we come to the time of Uther Pendragon, when we stumble on a remarkable omission. No word is written of Merlin, Uther Pendragon, that is, Dragon's Head, a most excellent youth, the son of Aurelius, to wit, brought from Ireland the dance of giants which is now called Stanehenges. This is all that Henry writes in his abstract about the matter, and it is safe to say all that he found of any interest about it in the original before him. Geoffrey's Merlin evidently, if he existed at all before 1139, had not yet found his way into Geoffrey's Arthurian epic. Beyond this conspicuous absence of Merlin from the story, the most striking point in Henry's summary is the account he gives of the passing of Arthur. When he was about to cross over the Alps, an envoy said unto him, "Modred, thy nephew, hath set thy crown upon his own head with the assistance of Cheldric, king of the English, and hath taken thy wife unto himself, Arthur not dead Arthur." Thereupon, seething over with wondrous wrath, returning into England, conquered Modred in battle, and after pursuing him as far as into Cornwall, with a few men fell upon him in the midst of many, and when he saw that he could not turn back said, "Comrades, let us sell our death dear. I, for my part, will smite off the head of my nephew and my betrayer, after which death will be a delight unto me." Thus spake he, and hewing a way for himself with his sword through the press, dragged Modred by the helmet into the midst of his own men, and cut through his mailed neck as through a straw, nathless as he went, and as he did the deed, so many wounds did he receive that he fell, albeit that his kinsmen the Britons deny that he is dead, and do even yet solemnly await his coming again. He was, indeed, the very first man of his time in warlike prowess, bounty and wit. In the brief remainder of his narrative Henry summarizes the story in accordance with the later version, and winds up thus: "These, then, my best, beloved Warren the Briton, are in brief that which I did promise thee, whereof if thou dost desire to read the whole length, make diligent enquiry after the great book of Geoffrey Arthur, which I found at the Abbey of Bec, wherein thou mayst find the aforesaid treated with sufficient fullness and clearness. Fare thee well." Before leaving the Chronicles of Robert of Torigny, it is worthwhile to quote the following entry under the year 1152. J.R. Sinners Ben M.S. Geoffrey Arthur, who had translated the history of the kings of the Britons out of the British into Latin, is made Bishop of St. Asaph in North Wales 3 here. Then, we have distinct and unimpeachable evidence that a version of Geoffrey of Monmouth's history of the British kings was extant in the Abbey of Bec early in 1139, and neither Henry nor Robert speak of it as being at that time a novel acquisition, that this version was substantially the same as the later version which has come down to us, with the cardinal exception that it contained no notice of Merlin and his prophecies, is clear enough. The omission of the story about the giants in the later version is to be regretted, as it seems to embody a genuine folklore tradition, and the variation in the account of Arthur's death is certainly significant, whatever its significance may be, but the main lines of the work are identical in both versions. One is an earlier, the other a later edition, that is all. At this point, a difficulty presents itself in reference to the date of both versions. As far back as 1770 Jules R. Sinner, the learned librarian of the city of Ben, in his catalogue of the MSS then in his charge, called attention to one of Geoffrey of Monmouth's history dedicated to King Stephen of England. Double dedication. The value of Sinner's catalogue was early recognized in England, but this particular entry remained practically unnoticed until 1858, when Sir Frederick Madden published an account of the MS. in the Journal of the Archaeological Institute for that year, in which he gave the text of the dedication and his own conclusions thereupon. After the first paragraph, which is identical with that already translated at the beginning of this volume, the dedication runs in English thus: "And to this little work of mine, therefore, do thou, Stephen, King of England, show favour in such sort, that with thee for teacher and adviser, it may be held to have sprung not from the poor little fountain of Geoffrey of Monmouth, but from thine own sea of knowledge, and to savour of thy salt, so that it may be said to be thine offspring, thine, whose uncle was Henry the illustrious King of England, whom philosophy hath nurtured in the liberal arts, whom thine own inborn prowess of knighthood hath called unto the command of our armies, and whom the island of Britain doth now in these our days hail with heartfelt affection, as if in thee she had been vouchsafed a second Henry. Do thou, also, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, our other pillar of the realm, lend thine assistance that, under the combined direction of ye both, the issue of my book now made public may shine forth in an even fairer light. For thee, unto whom was sire that same most renowned King Henry, hath thy mother, philosophy, taken unto her bosom, and indoctrinated thee in the subtleties of her sciences, and afterward directed thee unto the camps of kings that thou mightest achieve renown in knightly exercises, wherein, valiantly surpassing thy comrades in arms, thou hast learnt to stand forth as a terror unto thine enemies, and under thy father's auspices as a protection unto thine own people, to Stephen and Robert being, therefore, as thou art, the trusty protection of them that are thine own. Receive myself, thy prophet bard, and this my book, issued for thine own delectation, under thy protection, so that lying at mine ease beneath the guardianship of so far-spreading a tree, I may be able to pipe my lays upon the reed of mine own muse in safe security, even in the face of the envious and the wicked. Such, as nearly as I can render its amazing periods, is Geoffrey's double dedication. The mere pedestrian translator finds it somewhat difficult to keep pace with him, when he gets on to his stilts, and both here, and in the dedication to Robert alone, I have inferred from the context that Geoffrey wished to contrast his own poor little wellspring with the sea of knowledge, attributed to his patron. Literally, the phrase runs, not from the little fountain of Geoffrey of Monmouth, but, flavoured by the salt of thy Minerva, may be said, etc. Fortunately here only a question of style is involved. The genuineness and the date of the dedication are of considerably greater importance, Sir Frederick Madden, with regard to the first point, until some good reason for doubting its genuineness is forthcoming. The fair assumption is that it is what it professes to be, a dedication by Geoffrey to King Stephen and Robert of Gloucester at once. As far as style is any criterion, it is a case of aut Galfredas aut diabolus, and it is hard to surmise any motive that would induce a fraudulent editor at any time to fabricate so flatulent, and apparently so contradictory, an exordium to Geoffrey's work. Sir Frederick Madden, assuming its genuineness, assumes further that it must have been written at a time when Stephen and Robert were on friendly terms. He therefore assigns the date at which it was written to the period between April 1136 and May 1138, when Robert was bound by the oath of allegiance he had taken to Stephen in the first year of Stephen's reign. This conclusion, however, is based upon a fallacy. Robert came to England in 1136 and took a conditional oath of allegiance to Stephen, which he formally renounced in 1138, but the two were never on terms of friendship of a kind which would suggest to Geoffrey the idea of addressing them jointly as the two pillars of the realm. The very words of the dedication, in fact, refute Sir Frederick's attempt to explain their existence. His method begins at the wrong end. The date of the dedication has to be determined first of all by the best evidence attainable before any profitable discussion can be entered into as to the best means of accounting for it. In this case, one limiting date at least has been ascertained with sufficient certainty to render it needless here to quote the authorities on which it rests. This is the death of Alexander, Bishop of Lincoln, in February 1148. Date of Robert's death. Some authorities indeed appear to place it at 1147, but it is only an appearance, the chroniclers dating the years from Easter to Easter instead of from the 1st of January to the 1st of January. Now the Ben MS includes the prophecies of Merlin and the introductory chapter to Book 7, in which Geoffrey speaks of Alexander as dead at the time he writes. The date, then, of the original of the Ben MS, is certainly not earlier than February 1148. Here, however, we seem to have crossed the frontier of no man's land, for it is equally certain that the dedication was addressed to Robert of Gloucester during his life, and Robert is generally believed to have died in 1147. Obviously no genuine work could have been dedicated to the living Robert of Gloucester, if it was written after the death of a man who survived him. Yet the dedication of the Ben MS is clearly addressed to Robert as still living, for he is spoken of as being one of the pillars of the realm, and King Stephen as the other. The real date of Robert's death, therefore, becomes crucial for determining the character and credit of the Ben MS. What evidence exists on the point at issue? Gervase of Canterbury places Robert's death in 1146, and his high authority is corroborated by the Annals of Winchester. The Annals of Margan Abbey, which Robert himself founded, give the 31st of October, 1147, as the date, and, as far as the year goes, are corroborated by those of Tewkesbury and Waverley. John of Hexham gives 1148 as the date. For 3 different dates, which of the 3 years thus recorded is to be accepted as the true date of the event? The day of the month mentioned in the Margan Annals may safely be relied on as accurate, inasmuch as Founders' Day would doubtless be celebrated annually by a special service, and a mistake on such a point in the Abbey Chronicle is hardly a possible contingency. The presumption that the year as well as the day is correctly entered is also strong, though far from being so strong, for the day and not the year was the important point to the inmates of the Abbey, and the entry in this case is far from being contemporary with the event. The form, moreover, in which monastic canons were habitually kept very frequently led to entries being made under a wrong year. The strongest argument in favour of the latest date is the fact that wherever, as in John of Hexham and the Waverley Annals, the deaths of Bishop Alexander and Earl Robert are placed in juxtaposition, the death of the former always precedes that of the latter. Thus the Waverley Annals, which place the death of Alexander in 1147, place the death of Robert in the same year, but after the death of Alexander. The death of Alexander is certainly misplaced, and the inference is that the death of Robert is also misplaced as regards the year, although probably correctly entered as regards the true succession of events. 1148, probably correct. The Waverley Annals may therefore be regarded as supporting John of Hexham, who places both events in 1148. Upon the whole evidence, the existence of this joint dedication by Geoffrey seems to turn the scale distinctly in favour of the year 1148 as the date of Robert's death, and, in this case, the date of the original of the Ben MS, can only be some time between February and the end of October in that year. Within these very narrow limits we have next to search for some adequate reason which can have induced Geoffrey of Monmouth to dedicate his work at once to King Stephen, and to Earl Robert, then still on hostile terms, and to address them as the 2 pillars of the Kingdom of England. The search is far from being so hopeless as it seems at first sight. The history of the time is obscure, and Geoffrey's biography is obscurer still. But there are 2 well-established facts which seem to me to have a decisive bearing on this point, although both belong to a date, some few years later, than the deaths of the bishop and the earl. One of these is that in February, 1152, Geoffrey was ordained priest by Archbishop Theobald at Lambeth, and a fortnight later consecrated Bishop of St. Asaph. The other is that in November, 1153, his name appears as a witness to the memorable compact by which Stephen adopted Henry Fitz-Empress as his son and heir apparent to the crown of England. The reflex light which these 2 circumstances throw upon the Geoffrey of 1148 enables us to form a fairly accurate estimate of his prospects and position in that year. Geoffrey's position in 1148: he was then still a deacon, and possibly an archdeacon, for the title at that time had almost as many meanings as the word dean has still. That he was never Archdeacon of Monmouth is clearly established, but he may very well have been archdeacon in the school or college attached to the great monastery there, and it seems fairly certain that he subsequently held some official position of the same kind in the college at Llandaff. At any rate, in 1148, he was in deacon's orders, and, it is only reasonable to infer from his later career, on the lookout for a bishopric. In the abstract his claims were strong. He was a man of good character and conditions as well as of wide learning and great industry, and had written a book which was not only the most popular and generally interesting secular work of the age, but was calculated to exert, and did exert, no inconsiderable political influence. In the concrete, however, there was a bar to his claims which in a less anarchic age might well have been insuperable. This was that his elevation to a bishopric would require the confirmation of King Stephen, and that an earlier edition of his book had been dedicated to King Stephen's archenemy, Earl Robert. This, indeed, is only an inference, but it is a perfectly legitimate inference. Henry of Huntingdon, who, as we have seen, is our only authority with regard to this earlier edition, says nothing about its dedication for two very intelligible reasons. One, that the dedication had nothing whatever to do with the subject on which he was writing, and the other that when he made his abstract at Bec, he was travelling to Rome with Archbishop Theobald, whose election to the See of Canterbury had just been confirmed by King Stephen. Dedication to Robert, 1138. But the dedication itself supports the inference. It was written at a time when Britain was hailing Robert with heartfelt affection, as if in him, heaven had vouchsafed a second Henry, and also at a time when Robert's inborn powers had raised him to be the commander of the army. The two conditions tally exactly with the state of affairs in the summer of 1138, when Robert had renounced his allegiance to Stephen, and was heading the invasion of England in alliance with David of Scotland. The Battle of the Standard, the 22nd of August, had probably not yet been fought, and Robert was hailed as the coming saviour of England, the minister of divine vengeance on the perjurer and usurper Stephen. Apart from these arguments, however, a comparison of the two dedications shows clearly enough which is the earlier. From a literary point of view, it is impossible that the one to Robert alone could have been written after the joint one to Stephen, as well as Robert. How it came to pass that the dedication of the earlier edition came to be restored to the later one will be seen presently. Geoffrey's hopes of obtaining a bishopric would seem to have been fondly cherished for many years. I find it impossible to read his dithyrambic eulogy of the City of Legions, Caerleon upon Usk, without feeling that at the time he indited it he was haunted by archiepiscopal visions. Geoffrey's motives he saw, if I read what is written between his lines aright, that fair and glorious city, the palaces whereof might seem to vie with those of Rome herself, transmuted into a metropolitan see by a beneficent King Henry, or haply by a gracious Augusta, his daughter, now Maud, Lady of the English, and a certain humble cleric and man of genius, Geoffrey Arthur by name, and celebrated throughout Christendom for his History of the British Kings, consecrated metropolitan thereof and primate of all Wales. If Geoffrey ever indulged in such illusions, surely not impossibly extravagant in the later years of Henry's reign, they had vanished into thin air long before the year 1148. But if the archbishopric in Posse had disappeared, there were still English and Welsh bishoprics in Esse not altogether hopelessly beyond his reach. Here was Bishop Alexander of Lincoln just dead. Why should not Geoffrey succeed him? At least, he would call attention to his claims. He had not been idle all these years. He had been busy, among other things, with the prophecies of Merlin, which had already arrested popular interest and attention. Why not incorporate them in a new edition of his history? Then came the cruel difficulty. To whom could he dedicate the new edition? Clearly, King Stephen in some way or other must be so far propitiated as not to oppose his election. If Lincoln or any other see was to be obtained at all, so much was imperative, the rest was a matter of taste and judgment. Anarchy of the time, but it was practically impossible for Geoffrey to dedicate to Stephen alone a work which in an earlier form, he had already dedicated to Robert alone. It would be nothing less than to proclaim himself a renegade from the cause of Robert, a traitor to all the principles he had so earnestly advocated, a sneaking, time-serving hypocrite ready to sacrifice all the convictions he had ever professed on the altar of his own personal advancement. Even had he been any of these things, which he certainly was not, he would have been the last to desire to publish the fact to the world at large, but that irksome necessity of obtaining the royal assent still lay between him and what he considered the just reward of his deserts. The case was urgent and the days were evil. The Empress Maud had retired into Normandy more than 3 years before. Robert was still in Bristol, quiescent, probably ill, but expectant. The anarchy in the state was reflected in the anarchy of the church. If Stephen and Robert were the two pillars of the one, Stephen's brother Henry, Bishop of Winchester and papal legate, and Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, were the two pillars of the other. Legate Henry's darling ambition was to have the primacy translated from Canterbury to Winchester. Theobald's less daring counter-scheme was to transfer the legatine authority from Winchester to Canterbury in perpetuity. Only the year before, in 1147, Henry had been successful in ousting Theobald for a time from his see and from England. Theobald had retorted by returning to England a few months later, and placing all that part of it which owned allegiance Stephen under an interdict. Geoffrey to bishop under such malign influences in church and state. What could a poor aspirant to the vacancy of Lincoln do? What one such aspirant actually did, may, I think, be read in Geoffrey's dedication of the Ben MS. He took his courage and his book into both hands and dedicated the new edition with his left hand to King Stephen, and with his right to Robert of Gloucester, appending a post-mortem dedication of the newly incorporated prophecies of Merlin to Bishop Alexander, by way of a hint that the writer of the prophecies would be an excellent and useful successor to the See of Lincoln. This is how I read the dedication. Sitting on a fence is seldom a dignified or graceful performance, but if Geoffrey meant to be bishop, he had no choice but to go through it. There is a dash of real pathos in the clumsiness of his efforts to flatter one patron, without offending the other. We are looking on at the spectacle dear to the gods, the good man struggling with adversity. If ever Geoffrey flattered himself with the prospect of succeeding Bishop Alexander, he was soon disillusioned. 2 years passed away and the prophet was still without his reward. At long last, in 1152, there was a vacancy in the See of St. Asaph, a poor little see with a poor little cathedral. As Gerald de Barry not long afterwards described it, 5 the evil days had not mended, and half a loaf is better than no bread. The Archbishopric of Culzean had long since been consigned to the limbo of unrealized aspirations of St. Asaph. The real bishopric of Lincoln had been conferred upon another. Geoffrey and Geoffrey's world were growing old. If he was to enter on any earthly reward at all, he could no longer afford to be squeamish. The alternative presented to him was St. Asaph's or nothing, and he naturally preferred St. Asaph's, to which see he was consecrated in 1152. But there was no absolute obligation upon him to retire forthwith into the wilds of Wales, unfrequented as they were by the dispensers of ecclesiastical preferment. Earl Robert was dead, but his cause was rapidly rising into the ascendant. The Empress still lived, and Henry Fitz-Empress was growing up to manhood. His father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in 1151, and at his death Henry became Earl of Anjou as well as Duke of Normandy. The same eventful year also saw the young Duke married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the divorced wife of Louis VII of France, and the stars in their courses were fighting for the boy that was born to be king. Stephen read the omens, and by way of setting up a rival to the favourite of fortune, proposed that his own son Eustace should be crowned joint king of England with himself. Archbishop Theobald and the rest of the prelates refused to crown him. Henry Fitz-Empress himself, moreover, had landed in England but a short time after Theobald had consecrated Geoffrey bishop. Clearly it was no time for one who had deserved well of Henry's mother, and of all his kin to be piping his rustic reed on the banks of the Elwy, or the Clwyd. Geoffrey's death there was but a single life, that of Prince Eustace. Between Stephen and Henry Fitz-Empress in the succession to the crown, and if Henry should ever be king, even that other city upon dusk might yet hail Geoffrey as primate of all Wales. On the 18th of August, 1153, Eustace died, and Stephen was not unwillingly persuaded to adopt Henry as his son and heir to the crown of England. On the 7th of November in that year the solemn compact was duly signed, sealed and delivered, and fealty sworn to the future King Henry. To this momentous document Geoffrey signed his name as Bishop of St. Asaph. It now only remained for Stephen to depart in peace, and Merlin, the wizard of a new Arthur, might almost name his own reward. Meanwhile, it must not be said that Lai had neglected his episcopal duties at St. Asaph. When the winter was over, he would go first to Llandaff and make arrangements about his old house there and the college with which he had been so long connected, and then on to his little cathedral church on the Elwy, to wait for the better time. It was not to be. Geoffrey was never to enter on his earthly reward. He reached Llandaff, and there, in his own old house, he died in 1155, without having set foot within his own diocese. Stephen had died on the 25th of October, 1154. and Henry II had been crowned on the 19th of December. Henry, Bishop of Winchester, Stephen's brother, had fled the country. The long 19 years of anarchy and weary waiting were over. Geoffrey's hour had come at last, and it was his own last hour. Merlin's Prophecies. With regard to the prophecies of Merlin as a separate work from the history of the British kings, much remains to be said which cannot be said here. One of the earliest, and certainly the most important of all early references to Merlin, is to be found in the history of Lewis the Fat, written by his great minister and counsellor, Suger, Abbot of St. Denis. Lewis died in 1137, and Suger in 1152. But at what precise period this particular passage was written can now only be a matter of conjecture. Probably, however, 1148 to 1149 is the real date. The passage in English runs thus: "At that time it so befell that Henry, King of the English, had come into the parts of the Normans, a right valiant man renowned alike in peace and war, whose excellency, admired and famous throughout well, nigh the universal world, Merlin, that marvellous observer and recorder of the continuous course of events amongst the English, rustic prophet though he be, doth with no less elegance than truth extol with exceeding honour, for, bursting forth abruptly, as hath ever been the wont of seers, in his praise, he thus uplifteth his prophetic voice: The Lion of Justice, saith he, shall succeed, at whose roaring shall tremble the towers of Gaul and the dragons of the island. In his days shall gold be wrung from the lily and the nettle, and silver shall flow from the hooves of them that low. They whose hair is crisped and curled shall array them in party-coloured fleeces, and the garment without shall betoken that which is within. The feet of them that bark shall be cropped short. Abbot Suger, the wild deer shall have peace, but humanity shall suffer the dole. The shape of commerce shall be cloven in twain, the half shall become round. The ravening of kites shall perish, and the teeth of wolves be blunted. The lion's whelps shall be changed into fishes of the sea, and his eagle shall build her nest upon the mountains of Verari. The whole compass of this prediction, so weighty and so ancient, fits in so exactly with the strenuous character of the person indicated in his administration of the realm, that not one single iota, not one single word can be regarded as inconsistent with the precise applicability thereof. For even from this which is said at the end about the lion's whelps it is abundantly manifest that the prophecy hath proven true, seeing that his sons and daughters were shipwrecked, and being devoured of the fishes of the sea were physically transformed into them. The aforesaid King Henry, therefore, happily succeeding his brother William, as soon as he had by the counsel of experienced men and upright ordered the realm of England to their liking according to the rule of their ancient kings, and in order to secure their goodwill had confirmed by oath the ancient customs of the realm, made for the haven of his Norman duchy, and, relying on the help of the King of the French, bringeth back order to the land, restoreth the laws and imposseth peace upon compulsion, promising robbers naught less than the tearing out of their eyes or stark hanging, gallows high. Abbot Suger presently, therefore, under the strokes and stress of these and the like promises, and stricken, moreover, by their frequent fulfilment, for any man can be profuse in promises, the land is dumb at sight of him, and the Normans, in whose fierce Danske blood is no peace, keep peace against their will, thereby again verifying the words of the rustic prophet, for the ravening of kites doth perish, and the teeth of wolves are blunted when neither gentle nor simple durst presume to pillage or plunder save by stealth, and when he saith that at the roaring of the Lion of Justice the towers of Gaul, and the dragons of the island shall tremble, he intimateth this, that well nigh all the towers and whatsoever castles were strongest in Normandy, which is part of Gaul, he did cause to be either levelled with the ground, or otherwise subdued unto his will, either by settling men of his own therein, or, if they were destroyed, by confiscating their revenues to his own treasury. The island dragons also did tremble when none of the nobles of England, whosoever they might be, durst even grumble during his whole administration. In his days was gold wrung by him out of the lily, that is, from the religious of good odour, and from the nettle, that is from the stinging seculars, his intent being that as he was a prophet unto all, so also should all do service unto himself. For safer is it that all should have one to defend them against all, than for all to perish through one man for lack of such a defender. Silver flowed from the hoofs of them that low when the strength of the castle safeguarded the plenty of the grange, and the plenty of the grange assured abundance of silver in the well-filled coffers. 6 Merlin's prophecies. This passage is remarkable in several aspects. Written during Geoffrey's own lifetime, it enables us to say with certainty that the prophecies quoted cannot have originated later than 1152, the date of Suger's death. It is almost equally certain that they were in existence at least 4 or 5 years earlier, along with a number of others from which Suger selects these as bearing directly on the subject he has in hand. Among them is one which he leaves uninterpreted, relating to the form of commerce, which Merlin prophesies shall be cloven in twain, and further, that the half shall become round. The reference, of course, is to the silver penny, the only currency of the time in England. At what date the practice of cutting the penny in two may have introduced itself, for the purpose of creating a supply of halfpence, seems exceedingly doubtful. That it was a novelty when the prophecy suggested itself to Merlin's mind seems a fair inference, and in this case it would seem to have been first officially recognized in some of the middle years of Stephen's anarchy. The further prophecy, however, referring to the halfpenny becoming round, is curious at this date, inasmuch as the earliest circular halfpence known to numismatists date, at least 50 years later in the reign of John. Whether there were any actual issues of circular halfpence at an earlier date, or whether the prophecy is merely an instance of Merlin's intelligent appreciation of probabilities, is doubtful. Suger's praise of Merlin. The fact remains that the prophecy anticipates the issue of any round halfpence, now known by more than half a century. The tone in which Suger speaks of Merlin is also noteworthy. It is difficult to read the opening sentences of this passage without feeling that Suger intended to convey a compliment to Geoffrey. Knowing perfectly well that Merlin was only the alias of a living writer, it is true that he goes on to speak of the prophecies as weighty and ancient. Decrepit is the actual word he uses, but the reference to the extraordinary exactitude of the prophecies certainly looks like a hint to the wary reader that the writer's tongue is in his cheek, and that although he knows all about it he has no intention of spoiling Merlin's game. But however this may be, the most significant point in the passage is that Suger should have written it. Suger was no ordinary ecclesiastic or man of letters. At the time he wrote he was probably the greatest practical statesman in Christendom. His knowledge of men and political affairs was unequalled, and his common sense and tact were equal to his genius and knowledge. Yet this man goes out of his way to quote the prophecies of Merlin, with marked and significant approval, and to applaud their author as that marvelous observer and recorder of the continuous course of events amongst the English. Suger evidently rates Merlin's prophecies, and apparently Geoffrey's work generally, very much higher than some of his younger contemporaries, such as Gerald of Barry or William of Newburgh, both of them far from contemptible judges. Geoffrey's epic of the difference in his estimate seems to me essentially one of kind, rather than of degree. Gerald, perhaps even now better known by the Latin version of his name, Geraldus, and the Latin version of his adopted name the Welshman, Cambrensis, is always ready to quote Merlin as an authority whenever it suits him, but he treats Geoffrey himself with as much contempt as so polished an ecclesiastical wit will allow himself to show. William of Newburgh's frank onslaught upon Geoffrey is well known. He is shocked at Geoffrey's serene indifference to historic truth, and denounces the man as a liar without scruple. Merlin fares no better with him than Geoffrey. Merlin wrote a heap of lies and Geoffrey added to the heap. William is very angry. He himself is eminently sober, honest and judicious, earnestly jealous of the dignity of history. Why should this mountebank pretend to be a historian, and publish this pack of lies, as if they were eternal verities? Yet the fact that William places his denunciation of Geoffrey in the very forefront of his own history indicates that he is uneasily conscious of some quality in Geoffrey's book, which gives it a vitality and power of its own, independent of the falsehoods it contains. What is this quality? Suger, the statesman, I fancy, recognized it. If he did not, at least we of the latter day may recognize it. If ever tree was known by his fruit, the quality of this tree should be beyond all doubt or error, for never did tree bear more abundant fruit the kings of Britain. It is the parent stock of Arthurian romance. It is not a history, although it is in the form of a history, no history, nor even, save accidentally and very partially, a historical romance, but a romance of a distinct and peculiar stamp, a romance in the sense in which the Iliad, The Odyssey and the Aeneid are romances, a romance in the sense of a national epos, grotesque as the juxtaposition of such names by the side of the histories of the British kings may seem at first sight. It is, nevertheless, a true analogy. They are all trees in the orchard of national epos. If the Iliad and the Odyssey are the peach and nectarine, and the Aeneid, the melting pear, Geoffrey's histories may claim to be the quince of the fruit garden, crude and uneatable as gathered from the tree, yet with a flavour and perfume distinctively its own, poignant and delicious. A true national epos, I say, but of what nation? It is not English, not Norman, nor even Breton nor Welsh, yet all have their heroes allotted to them, and if all at one time are vanquished, all are at another the victors. In simple fact, we can never read Geoffrey right until we realize what nation it was of which he aspired to be the national writer of the national epic. In a word, it was the national empire of his time, and his time was that of Henry I, Stephen, and the first year of Henry II. The actual empire of Henry I consisted mainly in England, Normandy, Wales and Brittany. The actual empire of Henry II extended, in Freeman's historic phrase, from the Orkneys to the Pyrenees. The British Empire, the dominant idea of the two first Henrys, the son and great-grandson of the conqueror of England, was gradually to extend the frontiers of the Anglo-Welsh-Norman-Breton Empire until, in the fullness of time, the descendants of the mighty William should be the emperors of Christendom. When Henry II came to the throne, adding to the dominions so slackly held by Stephen, Normandy, and Joan Aquitaine, it might well seem that the dynastic dream was in a fair way to be accomplished within a measurable time. It was the want of cohesion between the various constituent elements of the empire, which was its greatest peril. If only Norman and Englishman, Welshman and Breton could be induced to work together in the common interest of the empire, there was no limit to the potentialities of its future greatness. The restoration of an empire mightier and broader than that of Charlemagne, nay, even than that of Augustus, was no impossibility, but a practical aim, towards the attainment of which all the resources known to the statecraft of the time should be directed. Among these resources was one which Henry I, the Beauclerc, the fine scholar of a time when Latin literature was familiar to all scholars, could not overlook. Virgil was still unquestioned emperor of profane letters, and the publication of his Aeneids had in old days been of incalculable advantage in consolidating and strengthening the empire of Augustus. He had made the empire glorious, and commended it to the intellect and imagination of the world of the Angevin kings. And how had he done this? By claiming for the founders of the Roman Empire the blood of the heroes of Troy, and transforming an exiled Trojan prince into a national hero of the Roman people. Why should not Henry do the same, or as nearly the same as the changed conditions would allow? That Virgil was inspired, in the modern sense, by Augustus is obvious. That Geoffrey, in the same sense, was inspired by Henry seems to me even yet more distinctly obvious. Henry, indeed, was no Augustus, and Geoffrey was far enough from being a Virgil, but in this respect the relations between the Roman emperor and the Mantuan poet were strictly analogous to those existing between the Norman king and the Welsh romancer. I have been unwilling to publish this translation without indicating at least what seems to me necessary to understanding the true significance and bearing of Geoffrey's book. It is an epic that failed, for it was to have been the national epic of an empire that failed. When John lost Normandy and much beside in the early years of the 13th century, that empire, never more than an inchoate empire, came to an end forever. King Arthur, Geoffrey's creation as Aeneas, was the creation of Virgil. The king who was to have been the traditional hero of the Anglo-Welsh-Norman-Breton nucleus of empire, and all the dominions which that empire might thereafter annex to its own, was left without any empire to hail him as the founder of its glories. Henry I, his policy he became a national hero unattached, a literary wonder and enigma to ages which had forgotten the existence of the composite and short-lived empire, which was the justification of his own existence. Seen from this standpoint, it seems to me that it is possible to trace with some confidence the gradual evolution of Geoffrey's great work, and the general course of his own life. That the work was begun in some form as early as 1129, seems a not unreasonable inference from the fact that he witnesses the Osney Charter, under the otherwise unintelligible double name of Geoffrey Arthur. At this time he is in close contact with Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, and it is at this period that he seems to have received from Walter the exceeding ancient book in the British tongue, which he professes to translate. This book has never been run to earth, and it seems most improbable that it ever will be. I am very doubtful, indeed, whether the word British here really connotes either Welsh or Breton, taking into account the prophecy of Merlin that the words England and English shall be superseded by the words Britain and British. It seems by no means certain that when Geoffrey writes British tongue, he does not by a prolapsus, in his case natural enough, mean simply English. However this may be, what seems the likeliest course of events is that Robert of Gloucester, or possibly enough his father Henry I, himself, or both, desirous of having a work written after the general model of the Annals, which should tend to familiarize the various peoples of Henry's dominions with the idea of a united nationality and a common empire, took counsel with Archdeacon Walter on the matter, and that Walter recommended Geoffrey as the most capable man of letters he knew to undertake the task. Origin of the epic. Walter accordingly drew up a rough sketch of what was required, with suggestions of his own, and handed his notes to Geoffrey. I cannot help thinking, too, that the work at first proposed was a poem, and that the two short poems at the beginning of the book were trial samples of the work. If such a project was ever entertained, it was early abandoned, and it was decided that the work should be in prose, and that Livy, perhaps, was a somewhat easier and safer model than Virgil to follow. Henry I died the 1st of December, 1135. At that time the work in its first form seems to have been nearly complete. As far as internal evidence goes, however, I think that the conclusion of the life of Arthur was altered, and added to after the death of Henry. That the portrait of Arthur is drawn in great part from the living Henry is clear, and no less clearly, it seems to me, is the treachery of Mordred suggested by the treachery of Stephen. In the version of the Histories seen by Henry of Huntingdon, it is evident that the passing of Arthur was treated in a more hopeful spirit than in the later version. The phrase in which Geoffrey speaks of Britain hailing Robert with joy, as if in him she had been vouchsafed to second Henry, reads like an echo of the belief that Arthur should come again. Text of the Histories. I incline, therefore, to assign the date of 1138 to this dedication in its first form, the time when Robert projected the invasion of England in the interests of the Empress, and received promises of support from the Scots king and a number of the English barons. The ordinary text of the Histories, that here translated, differs from the original, which was condensed by Henry of Huntingdon in one momentous respect. It omits the reference to the return of Arthur and several other details of minor interest, but it adds the prophecies of Merlin. These prophecies, in spite of the vaticinal jargon in which they are written, are most of them easy enough to read and interpret by anyone familiar with the class of literature of which Old Moore's Almanac may be instanced as a still extant example. By far the greater part of them are of course mere ex post facto prophecies, and in not a few cases it is easy enough to date them as having been written after the fulfillment of the prediction. There is, however, a considerable residue consisting of predictions written in anticipation of things to be. Some of these it is also possible to date, inasmuch as they were obviously written before the non-fulfillment of the prediction. In the natural course of events, the number of prophecies, which did not come off as the prophet intended they should, began to multiply, and it became necessary to multiply Merlins in order to maintain the credit of one Merlin by shouldering off the responsibility of the falsified predictions onto another. Extra Merlins. The appearance, therefore, of 2, 3 or more Merlins is a phenomenon, the occurrence of which any Merlin of ordinary intelligence might safely have ventured to predict. These extra Merlins of course do not necessarily imply the existence of more than one living Merlin, any more than the cast sloughs of a snake imply the existence of more than one living snake. But apart from this consideration, there is an even more potent cause for the multiplication of Merlins to be found in the tendency of many minds to indulge in political prediction, and to support the credit of their predictions by attributing them to oracles of higher authority than themselves. Merlin was a most desirable alias of the kind. It was a name to conjure with, second only in authority to Holy Writ, equal to the Sibyl or Virgil himself. Now in studying the Book of Merlin, I think it is possible to detect the work of at least 2, and probably more than 3 different hands. The bulk of the work, no doubt, is Geoffrey's own. This, indeed, he himself intimates not obscurely in the dedication to Bishop Alexander. I think, however, it may be shown that some of the prophecies were simply collected and edited, not originally written, by Geoffrey, and here and there I recognize a note suspiciously like that of a certain Merlin, who was still gaily chirping some quarter of a century after Geoffrey's death. Prophecy and politics as a political weapon. Prophecy has been found effective in all recorded ages of history. We, to whom in our own time it has proved of signal service in northwest India, need neither dispute nor disparage its efficiency. Both as statesman and Latin scholar, Henry I. was well acquainted with the act of disseminating prophetic words among the people, and there is no reason to doubt that Geoffrey Merlin was as duly inspired as Geoffrey the historian of Arthur. Many of the prophecies, however, are of demonstrably later date than the death of Henry, and it seems likely that at that time, although some of them may have been in existence, they were too few to be thought worthy of publication in the history itself. By way of illustration, it may be well here to quote one prediction which dates itself as of the reign of Stephen, thereafter, that is, after the reigns of the Saxon kings, from the first unto the fourth, from the fourth unto the third, from the third unto the second, shall the thumb be rolled in oil. This last phrase shows that Merlin was acquainted with the ceremony employed in the anointing of kings, in which the officiating archbishop rolls his thumb in the unguent, in order to apply it to the person of the king. The first, then, here signifies William the Conqueror. From him the succession passes to the fourth. William Rufus answers to the designation, seeing that his elder brother, Duke Robert of Normandy, and his 2 sons were still alive, all of whom, according to usual feudal custom, would have inherited before William. From the fourth it passes to the third, Henry I, to wit, at whose accession Robert and 1 son of Robert were still alive. Date of the prophecies. From the third it passes to the second, to wit, Stephen, whose own elder brother was alive when he usurped the crown. The special point of this prophecy is that it could not have been written before the days of Stephen, inasmuch as Stephen had solemnly sworn fealty to the Empress Maud, who was expected to succeed her father, and could not be described in any sense as second. Others of the predictions date themselves as clearly, and Geoffrey seems to have issued more than one edition of them, as a separate work during the early years of Stephen's reign. The original of the Ben MS, which I have already assigned to the central months of 1148, seems to me to represent the earliest form in which the entire work as known to us was issued. The dedication of it to Stephen and Robert jointly seems naturally accounted for by the fact that, if Geoffrey was desirous of obtaining a bishopric, he was practically compelled to propitiate Stephen, at least to the extent of inducing him not to withhold the royal assent to his promotion. After Stephen's adoption of Henry, and Geoffrey's elevation to the see of St. Asaph, the joint dedication became useless, and possibly mischievous as well as incongruous, and Geoffrey would be glad to restore the dedication as it stood in the first edition of the work before the Merlin editions were made, for 2 reasons. Robert was then dead, but Robert's cause had triumphed, and the dedication to Robert would at least seem to add some years to the antiquity of Merlin's prophecies. The Ben MS, the text I have followed, the Vulgate text, I therefore take to be founded on MSS of about the year 1153, but some few of the Merlin prophecies, which obviously, in their present form at least, relate to events as late as the time of John, can only have crept into the text at a later date. Such then are, I believe, all the facts in relation to Geoffrey and his work that rest on trustworthy authority, and such the interpretation which seems to me to explain and coordinate the facts in the simplest manner. But more light is sadly needed before the enigma presented by the histories can be fully and satisfactorily solved. Professor W. Lewis Jones, to whose courtesy I am indebted for much information in reference to the Ben MS, and Mr. G. B. Matthews have for some years had in contemplation an edition of that unique document, for the Honourable Society of Simradorian, and in the interests of literature, it is greatly to be desired that such an edition should be published at an early day. The date assigned to it by Sir Frederick Madden is, as far as I can judge from internal evidence, about 10 years too early, but if the true date is 1148, It is not improbably a direct transcript of the author's own MS, and represents the last recension but one of the entire work. In any case, the spelling of proper names is distinctly more satisfactory than in any of the extant printed editions. Previous translation, of these that edited by San Marte, in 1854 still remains the last and best. But the half-century that has since elapsed has wrought many revolutions, literary and other, and a new critical edition of Geoffrey's history by Welsh scholars would be nothing less than an invaluable boon to all interested in Arthurian lore. Of previous translations I know only one, the British History, translated into English from the Latin of Geoffrey of Monmouth, with a large preface concerning the authority of the history. By Aaron Thompson, late of Queen's College, Oxon, Data hac venia antiquitati, ut miscendo humana divinis, primordia urbium Augustura faciat, liv. Printed by J. Boyer at the Rose in Ludgate Street, H. Clements at the Half Moon, and W. and J. Innes at the Prince's Arms in St. Paul's Churchyard, MDCCXVIII. This was republished by J. A. Giles, LL.D., late Fellow of Christ Church College, Oxford, in 1842, James Bone, 12 King William Street, Strand. In this edition, says Dr. Giles in his preface, the translation of Thompson has been followed, revised and corrected wherever the phraseology appeared to be unsuited to the more accurate ears of the present day. As I have been under no obligation to either edition, it is perhaps better not to speak further about them. This translation has been made from San Mart's, Albert Schultz's edition of the original, 2 passages in different parts of the work, amounting to some 6 or 8 lines in all, I have omitted, and 2 or 3 others I have slightly modified for reasons which seem to me sufficient. In the matter of proper names, it seemed to me absurd to be fastidious, where no fixed standard exists. Translation of names Walgan and Lear, Cordelia and Gunhumera are strangers to many who know and love to read of Gawain and Lear, Cordelia and Guinevere. In cases of this kind, therefore, I have preferred the form of the name consecrated by the usage of our great national poets, to that in which it appears in the printed text of Geoffrey. The rest, for the most part, I leave as I find. Sometimes I have struck off a Latin termination and sometimes I have not. Sometimes I have written Ireland or York where Geoffrey has written Hibernia or Caer-Ebroch, and the like. When a critical edition of the original text appears, it will be perhaps worthwhile to be more particular. In some few instances I have been troubled with scruples. It is quite open to question whether it is better to write Brutus or Brute as the name of the eponymous hero of Britain. And more than once or twice it is doubtful whether Anglus is better rendered by Angle or Englishman, and Francus by Frank or Frenchman. A scruple of another kind came in my way when fealty to Geoffrey seemed to clash with fealty to Milton. I had at first intended to make use of Milton's version of the lines in which Brute addresses the oracle of Diana and Diana gives her response. I found, however, that Milton had deliberately shrunk from translating the main point of the goddess's reply, the promise of universal empire to the descendants of Brute. I was therefore compelled to substitute a translation of my own. These are the words of Milton from the first edition of his History of Britain, 1670. Milton and Geoffrey consultation had, Brutus taking with him Geoffrey his diviner, and 12 of the Ancientest, with wonted ceremonies before the inward shrine of the goddess, in verse, as it seems the manner was, utters his request, Diva potens nemorum, etc., goddess of shades, and huntress, who at will walk street on the rolling sphere, and through the deep, on thy third reign the earth look now, and tell what land, what seat of rest thou bidst me seek, what certain seat, where I may worship thee free, with temples vowed and virgin choirs, to whom, sleeping before the altar, Diana in a vision that night thus answered, Brute sub occasum solis, etc. Brutus far to the west, in th' ocean wide beyond the realm of Gaul, a land there lies, sea-girt it lies, where giants dwelt of old, now void, it fits thy people, thither bend thy course, there shalt thou find a lasting seat, there to thy sons another Troy shall rise, and kings be born of thee, whose dreaded might shall awe the world, and conquer nations bold. These verses, originally Greek, were put in Latin, saith Vironius, by Gildas, a British poet, and him to have lived under Claudius. Milton on brute kings, which granted true, adds much to the antiquity of this fable, and indeed the Latin verses are much better than for the age of Geoffrey ap Arthur, unless perhaps Joseph of Exeter, the only smooth poet of those times, befriended him, in this Diana overshot her oracle, thus ending, Ipsis totius terras seditus orbis erit, that to the race of brute kings of this hand, the whole earth shall be subject.